So, how does a stand-up comedian and TV host end up building an empire that actually rivals entire news networks? Well, let me tell you, it is no accident. It's a blueprint, and it's built from trauma, discipline, and a fighter's philosophy. So in this explainer, we're going to deconstruct Joe Rogan's idea tree to figure out that blueprint, and more importantly, to show you how you can start building your own.
Right, and this really gets to the core of it. Your personal philosophy, it's not something you're just born with. Nope, it's something you actively build piece by piece. It is an active choice. By really studying the figures who shape our world, the good, the bad, and the really, really complicated, we can pick and choose which traits we want to add to our own blueprint for life. Okay, so for this, we're going to use Joe Rogan as our case study. We're going to build out his entire creative family tree, mapping out the roots of his drive, the philosophies that guide him, the strategies that built his empire, and yeah, even the harshest critiques of his influence. And look, the goal here isn't to put him on a pedestal or tear him down. It's about understanding the entire blueprint.
All right, every story has an origin point, right? And for Rogan, that story was forged in some serious psychological hardship. These early struggles, they weren't just bumps in the road. They became the literal engine for his ambition. So let's dig into those roots.
What you're looking at here is a classic example of something psychologists call post-traumatic growth. I mean, for some people, trauma just breaks them. But for others, it becomes rocket fuel. Sources point to his early childhood trauma and what Rogan himself has described as brief, violent flashes of domestic violence. This seems to have created this deep-seated fear of being a loser, which when you combine it with a lifelong battle with depression, he just channeled it into this relentless source of motivation.
So the big question is, how did he deal with it? Well, instead of going for what he saw as, solutions that might just numb him out, he took a totally different path, an anti-fragile one. He basically treated his struggle like a weight that needed to be lifted, and he channeled all that energy into extreme personal discipline, working, writing, hitting the gym. The goal, as he calls it, is neutral buoyancy, a state of calm that you don't get by avoiding pressure, but by mastering it through constant, focused work.
Okay, so this brings up a really powerful question for you, and I'd love to see what you think in the comments. What's one challenge in your life that you've managed to turn into a strength? Sharing these stories can be a really powerful exercise for all of us, so go ahead, pause for a second, and add your experience to the conversation.
All right, so let's keep building this tree. That psychological blueprint we talked about, it got supercharged by a philosophy he didn't learn from a book. He learned it on the mats. Martial arts, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu in particular, gave him this incredible mental model for dealing with failure, and he's applied it to his entire public career.
And this idea of tapping out is it's brilliant. It's the key to the whole thing. In jiu-jitsu, tapping out isn't a sign of weakness at all. It's actually an act of intelligence. You're admitting that your opponent's strategy was better, in that one moment. You take the small loss to avoid a big injury, you figure out what went wrong, and you come back smarter. You're literally turning failure into pure actionable data.
Okay, so that's in the gym, but how does this play out in the court of public opinion? Well, when he's faced with a big controversy, Rogan often uses this exact same strategy. Instead of digging his heels in, he'll publicly acknowledge the mistake. That's the tap. He gives a tactical apology, accepts the fault, and then almost immediately he pivots to moving forward. It's this incredible way to just absorb massive public hits without completely shattering that image of authenticity he's built.
But here's where it gets really fascinating. How did this mindset, this mix of hardcore discipline and learning from failure, how did that scale up into a media empire? Because he didn't just get lucky with a podcast, he strategically built a whole new model for media.
When you look at this timeline, you can really see the whole evolution. He started out as talent inside the traditional system, right? Using shows like Fear Factor to build a national platform. But the crucial moment, the real pivot point, was in 2009 when he launched the podcast. He went from being, a cog in someone else's machine to building his own damn machine, one that would eventually become way more powerful than the old ones.
And if you really want to grasp the scale of what he built, just look at this number, 200 million. That's not his net worth. That was his monthly downloads before the Spotify deal. He created a platform where long, unscripted conversations built a level of intimacy with an audience that old-school media could only dream of. He wasn't just competing with cable news anymore. He had built his own network that went straight to the consumer, and it absolutely dwarfed them.
But here's the thing. When you build an empire that big, you also end up building some pretty high walls around it. And with that kind of influence, you get intense scrutiny. And that's when a really powerful counter-narrative started to take shape. One that reframes this whole thing not as a place for open dialogue, but as something, Well, something far more controlling.
So on the surface, the goal was simple, right? Especially with his comedy club in Austin, he wanted to create a kind of utopia, a sanctuary for comedians, a place that felt like home, totally free from the gatekeepers of the old industry. That was the promise, loud and clear. But then a really scathing critique comes out, and it draws this shocking parallel. It argues that this supposed promised land became something else entirely. This viewpoint claims what was built was less a creative community and more of an authoritarian system. So where does a claim that intense even come from? Okay, the key concept here is something called a hyperreal simulacrum. I know, that sounds super academic, so let's just break it down. Think of it like a super immersive video game. It's a constructed reality with its own rules, its own heroes, its own villains, and for the people inside it, it starts to feel more real and more important than the actual outside world. The critique argues that Rogan's inner circle became exactly that. So according to this critique, this whole constructed reality is held up by a few key pillars. It demands that Rogan be venerated as the central figure. It keeps up this defiant anti-establishment identity, even while holding immense power. It creates a special, elevated class of real comedians. And, crucially, it demands loyalty. Members are expected to align with the group's reality over their own, a process that the critique calls, pretty harshly, a kind of philosophical suicide. Okay, so we've looked at the blueprint for massive success and a serious warning about its dark side. So take a second. From everything we've just talked about, what is one lesson, either something to copy or something to avoid, that you would add to your own idea tree? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to see what patterns pop up in our own collective idea tree. So here we are, right? We're left with these two totally conflicting stories. The disciplined martial artist who built an empire of open talk and the charismatic leader of an insulated, simulated world. The truth? As always, it's probably woven somewhere in that messy middle. But now let's pivot and bring this all back to the person who matters most in this equation, you. So what's the big takeaway here? I mean, what are you supposed to do with all this conflicting info? Do you just dismiss the guy or do you deify him? Well, the whole idea tree approach says you do neither. You become a strategic student of the whole picture. You see, a real genealogy of ideas, it's not about finding perfect heroes to worship. It's about studying complex, flawed people. You analyze and you steal from those bright yellow branches, the discipline, the strategic thinking. And you study and learn from the dark, thorny branches, the potential to create echo chambers, the dangers of living in a simulated reality. There are powerful, absolutely essential lessons on both sides. So here's the practical part. Here's how you can actually apply this stuff right now. First, isolate the discipline. What specific part of his work ethic or mindset could you adapt for your own goals? Second, learn from the failures. How can that tap-out philosophy help you navigate your own setbacks with more intelligence and, frankly, more grace? And finally, you have to heed the warnings. Looking at these critiques, what ideological traps or echo chambers do you need to be on the lookout for in your own life? And that leads us to the final question I want to leave you with. Who is a complex figure that you study? I mean, someone who isn't just a simple hero or a villain, but a source of both incredibly valuable lessons and critical warnings. What is the most important thing they've taught you? Really think about that, because that is the real work. That's how you build your own powerful, one-of-a-kind genealogy of ideas.